Hi, I'm Terry Lynn, and I'm so glad you're here today. This series of 3 videos is called Achieving Luminosity with Transparent Watercolors. They're all about 1.5 hours long and jam-packed with info you may never have heard about, unless you've attended one of Jim's workshops somewhere in the world, read his book, watched his DVD videos, or just wonder what this dude does with watercolors. What's important is that you have an opportunity to learn a lot. Jim's letting it out to the world free of charge. If you're a watercolor artist, this first video, Discovering Clean Color Combinations, was quite a groundbreaker, and still is. Techniques are timeless, and this, as well as the next 2 videos, are packed with valuable information you'll love. You'll notice that some graphics will pop up on the screen and then disappear before you can study them. So I thought it would be a great idea to give you a heads up. Right after my intro, and before you start the Discovering Clean Color Combinations video, you'll have a chance to pause and take screenshots of the watercolor wheel, guidelines, the matrix, and one more thing that's even more important, a simplified 3-ring wheel, then print the 3 photos or just set your screenshots to the side. Once you have the charts, you can pause the upcoming video, Discovering Clean Color Combinations, whenever you want, as a reference to clarify something. For some odd reason, he decided to include the way it was when he sent it to Watson Guptill, as well as the way the publisher presented it. You can choose what you want or all 3 photos, although the 3-ring wheel takes center stage in color mixing. It's all free, so have at it. I think he was a bit tense and nervous in the first 5 minutes or so of his first video, since he did all of his videos completely alone, but he loosened up once he was at his easel. The information you'll glean will become more and more clear as he demonstrates lots of ways to develop clean, saturated color combinations and what happens when you think you have the right mixture. And it dries, looking kinda muddy. By the way, there's a great demonstration at the end of each of the 3 videos. Fortunately, Jim has upgraded the resolution using the latest video AI technology, so you can enjoy it with a bit more clarity. The following videos in the series were each completed a few years apart as technology steadily improved. Tech moves on, right? I'm certain you'll find inspiration and valuable insights on how to achieve luminosity with your watercolors, as well as what makes it muddy. So, when you're ready, and you've had a chance to look over your charts, then dive right into discovering clean color combinations. Ciao!
I'm looking forward to this highly visual format because it will allow me to personally explore with you my watercolor wheel as well as some of the other factors that affect luminosity. This series is entitled Achieving Luminosity with Transparent Watercolor. Luminosity is the attribute that distinguishes a well-executed transparent watercolor painting from one using an opaque medium. It's a term that's often used, but perhaps how it relates to transparent watercolors is new for you. So let me try to define its use. When watercolor pigments are properly applied to the paper, light passes and refracts through the paint layer, then onward through the transparent external, reflects off the white paper, and returns through the external sizing and crystals of paint particles, illuminating them like stained glass. It's this stained glass effect that we call luminosity. Well, you should always be cognizant of what it will take to achieve the glow and simultaneously what will destroy it. Throughout my research and experimentation, I became aware of the many factors that can affect luminosity. We'll cover the three most important in this video series. They're color mixing, water to paint ratio, and brushwork. We won't be covering subjects such as the physical properties of paints, paint additives, or paper selection. But since these subjects are covered in my book, I suggest you utilize it along with the video series as you explore the overall subject of luminosity. This first workshop video, Discovering Clean Color Combinations, will fully acquaint you with the transparent watercolor wheel, perhaps the single most important tool available for teaching you how to avoid muddy color combinations and how to consistently choose clean, luminous ones. We'll also do a series of exercises that will show you how to apply the theory, and I'll end up the workshop with a painting demonstration. All three videos in this series finish up with a demo where I apply the lesson just taught. On the second tape, called The Mysterious Juicy Wash Demystified, we'll tackle the seldom taught concept of water to paint ratio. In my classes, I found the majority of my students, including some who are advanced, don't understand how to properly suspend their watercolors. Either the wash is too watery and undersaturated, looking anemic, or applied too heavily, looking like poster paint. Correcting this is simple. Create juicy washes and apply them properly. But what is a juicy wash, and how do I know when it's properly suspended? The video on water to paint suspension is sure to ignite the bulb for you regarding what the masters refer to as the mysterious juicy wash. Years of practice can be cut down to a rained-out weekend if you apply the instruction. We'll also be taking the technique well beyond the basics with exercises on floating in color to create extraordinary visual effects. Finally, we need to know how to properly place that juicy wash onto our paper. The third video, entitled Efficient Brushwork, Articulating Our Expression, will provide all the necessary information. Remember, no matter how transparent your combination of colors, you can't overwork the brush without losing some measure of luminosity. Color combines with the sizing and soaks into the paper. When the external sizing barrier is destroyed and the paper is saturated with color, the paper can't illuminate the paint crystals because it can't reflect light. This video will offer exercises to help you make your brushwork more economical. Use a lighter touch and reduce overworking by practicing patience. You'll see what I mean. Well, there's a lot more to creating a successful painting than simply paying attention to luminosity. But learning these basics one step at a time will remove many of the frustrating roadblocks in your path to creativity. You'll become a much better painter than you are today, and more quickly than you ever thought possible. So let's move on to the watercolor wheel and see how selective color mixing can increase your chances for a mudless, successful painting. As with most color wheels, the colors are arranged on these rings in a counterclockwise order, running from yellows at the top through reds at about 8 o'clock, and then blues, greens, and then back up to yellow. This arrangement allows us to make color selections for complements, triads, and analogous colors as conveniently as with other wheels. But now we can choose the best color combination that suits our purpose and know that the wash, when it dries, will be radiant, or in certain cases even dull if that's what you want. Two of the rings are subcategories, so for simplicity's sake, let's couple them with their parent ring. Well, if you learn how the three primary rings interrelate and understand and abide by the limitations, you can select color combinations with confidence. With just 3 rings, understanding the guidelines that govern color relationships is very easy. We're going to begin by looking at the 3 primary rings one by one. Let's take the innermost ring on the wheel, where you'll find the transparent non-staining colors. And in order to make this as simple as possible, we'll combine it with the second ring of semi-transparent non-staining colors, forming our first primary ring, transparent and semi-transparent non-staining colors. The third ring on the full wheel is where the transparent staining colors reside. This ring will stand alone as our second primary ring, transparent staining colors. Now, combining rings 4 and 5 from the full wheel, we form our third primary ring, where the opaque and semi-opaque colors will reside, along with the whitened and blackened opaques and semi-opaques. They're all in the same ring. Keep in mind, the first primary ring is non-staining, and the second primary ring is staining, yet both are transparent. The first major category is the transparent and semi-transparent non-staining group. Their pigments are very fine and are compatible with all colors. The only difference between these two is that the semi-transparent colors are slightly more opaque. The second major category is the one to watch out for. These transparent staining colors have been dubbed the devil colors by students. The pigments are so fine they bear the unfortunate idiosyncrasy of sometimes attacking other colors and staining, then dulling them. The more coarse the pigment it's mixed with, or the more opaque, the more lifeless the result. Well, while some colors stain the paper and don't remove easily, that doesn't always mean that particular color belongs on the staining ring. For instance, most quinacridone colors, raw and burnt sienna, and sap green are examples of colors that stain the paper, but they don't attack other colors and change their characteristics adversely, meaning they don't turn the combinations to mud. It's the colors that attack other colors, staining their particles, that I call staining colors. You probably already know that if you mix too many opaques together, you'll end up with a dull, muddy mess. But did you know that if you mix an opaque with a transparent staining color, you'll probably have just as dull a combination once it dries? Why? Once again, because the super refined staining color particles impregnate the coarse opaque particles and effectively block the light from passing through them to the white paper and then reflecting back. The third major category consists of opaque and semi-opaque colors combined with the whitened and blackened opaques and semi-opaques. These colors are the obvious targets for the devil colors, the transparent staining colors. The more opaque the color, the less luminosity it has to begin with. To mix these colors with the aggressive staining colors is bound to create a dull or muddy combination. You may be asking yourself, why not simply stay with the transparent and semi-transparent colors and forget about the rest? After all, they mix a full range of colors and nearly create a rich black. What's more, they're always luminous and glowing. Well, the other categories have their distinct moments and advantages too. I must admit that at least 75% of my painting is done with transparent non-staining colors, and I'll demonstrate that later in this video. However, when I want darker colors with rich color saturation, I'll choose to mix transparent staining colors with each other. I follow the guidelines, which you'll see a bit later, and the colors glow. Now, you might ask, if there's so much concern with opaques, why should I use them? Frankly, I don't use them a lot, except perhaps when I need the impression of some weight and mass in a subject. I seldom use whitened or blackened opaques and semi-opaques. They seem unnaturally dull. As you can see, the colors in the three major categories each have their own moments, but as far as reliability is concerned, I'd say the first primary ring is the most dependable and predictable, followed by the staining colors on the second primary ring, which are mixed more successfully moving inward to the transparent non-staining colors than outward to the opaques. Finally, the opaques on the third primary ring are often the most problematic because they don't mix well with the staining colors and are severely limited in the number of other colors in the same category that can be mixed. But on the positive side, they actually become less opaque when mixed with a transparent non-staining color from the first ring. Now that you've seen the watercolor wheel and have an idea how it works, let's take a closer look at each category using a very handy tool for determining what the outcome of mixing the various color categories might be. It's a matrix, and as you can see, the color categories are arranged in white boxes across the top, as well as along the left side. It reads like a mileage chart, so it doesn't matter if you read from Chicago to Boston or Boston to Chicago, the result is the same. I'll also be giving you some simplified guidelines and a few tips that you might want to jot down. Here are the guidelines for the transparent or semi-transparent non-staining colors when they're mixed with other transparent or semi-transparent non-staining colors. Transparent non-staining colors mix or glaze very well with other transparent non-stainers without restrictions. Semi-transparent non-staining colors may be used like transparents, only with a little more prudence and restrictiveness. Now here's how the matrix displays the results. If you mix transparents or semi-transparents together with themselves, as you can see by the intersecting box, you'll have a transparent and luminous result. Easy enough? Let's move on to the transparent staining colors mixed with other transparent staining colors. The guideline states that transparent staining colors mix or glaze very well with other transparent staining colors. As a tip, these colors are so supersaturated it's best to use them in a well-suspended solution. Another tip is to add the darkest transparent staining colors to any mixture slowly, as they can quickly overwhelm lighter colors. The matrix now shows us the combination of stainers with stainers is also transparent and luminous. Terrific! Let's see what happens when we mix transparent staining colors with transparent non-staining and semi-transparent non-staining colors. Remember, this could just as well be stated the other way around. The first guideline, transparent staining colors mix well with transparent non-staining colors. Next, transparent staining colors mix fairly well with semi-transparent non-staining colors. A tip that's worth restating: add the darkest transparent staining colors to a mixture slowly and keep them well suspended in water. The matrix has this advice for mixing stainers with non-stainers. Generally successful. Transparents are slightly dulled by staining dyes. Add the stainers slowly. Okay, this is where things get a little more interesting. Now we'll check out mixing transparent staining colors with opaques and semi-opaques. But here's the guideline. Mixing a transparent staining color with an opaque or semi-opaque will yield a dull but possibly acceptable result. And the observation, which I mentioned before, the more coarse the color you mix a transparent staining color with, the less desirable. Cadmiums are often among the opaques that are most adversely affected by the stainers. The matrix makes all of this pretty clear and concise. It reads, very dull, especially the cadmiums and the more opaque colors. Are you beginning to see how following these guidelines might save you from launching into a poor color combination? Next, rather than using the stainers, let's look into mixing transparent and semi-transparent non-staining colors with the opaques and semi-opaques. Here's our first guideline. Mixing a transparent non-staining color with an opaque or semi-opaque yields an acceptable result. Quite a dramatic difference from the dull results produced by the transparent staining colors. A second guideline states, the more opaques or semi-opaques you use in the mixture, the less luminosity. Remember, the more the muddier. Here's a tip. Mixing a transparent non-stainer with an opaque or semi-opaque will actually make the mixture more transparent than if the opaque or semi-opaque was used alone. Here's how the matrix explains the combination. Okay, best to use one with a maximum of 2 semi-opaques or 1 opaque with the transparent non-staining colors. Again, the more the muddier. You can see that the semi-opaques and opaques can cause concerns. Well, what happens when we mix opaques and semi-opaques with themselves? Mixing 2 semi-opaques or opaques together will generally yield an acceptable or marginal result. Here's a good one. 3 or more semi-opaques or opaques will generally create a fine example of mud. An exception, I think, is worth mentioning. When mixing one cadmium color with another, the combination is simply another cadmium color, so the 3 cadmiums won't become muddy. On the other hand, they won't become any less opaque either. How does the matrix illustrate the guidelines? 2 are marginally okay. 3 or more are muddy. Well, 4 more to go. Hopefully this is making sense to you. Next, let's explore what happens when we mix opaques and semi-opaques with whitened or blackened opaques and semi-opaques. The first guideline shouldn't surprise you. Mixing a semi-opaque or opaque with a whitened or blackened semi-opaque or opaque will generally yield an acceptable, if not marginal, result. The next guideline states 2 or more semi-opaques or opaques will create a grayed, dull, and murky result. The matrix doesn't think much more highly of the combinations. 2 are marginally okay, 3 or more are gray and murky. These aren't the best color choices you can make unless you want the weight of the colors to add the sense of mass or produce a mute passage. Our next combination concerns mixing whitened or blackened opaques and semi-opaques with themselves. Undoubtedly, you've caught on to the scenario by now. Here's the first guideline. Mixing a whitened or blackened semi-opaque or opaque with another whitened or blackened semi-opaque or opaque will generally yield an acceptable, if not marginal, result. The next guideline, 3 or more whitened or blackened semi-opaques or opaques mixed together will create a chalky and often grayed mud puddle. Well, when we check out the matrix, we find a less than desirable result. It states 2 are sometimes okay, 3 or more are muddy, chalky, or gray. Personally, I avoid combining these colors. Just when you thought all of this was going downhill, we run into a more satisfactory combination. We'll mix transparent or semi-transparent non-staining colors with the whitened or blackened opaques and semi-opaques. Here, the guidelines help us by explaining that mixing a transparent or semi-transparent non-staining color with a whitened or blackened opaque or semi-opaque yields an acceptable result. The guideline logically states, the more opaques or semi-opaques you use in the mixture, the more dull. Well, the more the muddier. The tip is encouraging. Mixing a transparent non-stainer with a whitened or blackened opaque or semi-opaque will actually make the mixture more transparent than if these opaques or semi-opaques were used alone. The matrix can't quite squeeze all of that in, but it does say, okay, best to use 1. Maximum 2 semi-opaques or 1 opaque with the transparents. The more, the muddier. The last, and probably the strongest contender for the worst combination award is transparent staining colors mixed with blackened or whitened opaques and semi-opaque colors. Our simplified guideline states, mixing a transparent staining color with a blackened or whitened opaque or semi-opaque will generally yield a dull and gray result. As an opinion rather than a tip, for the most part, this is one of the least desirable combination of colors if you're searching for luminosity. When we look at the intersecting boxes of the matrix, we find a concise and emphatic statement, dull and gray. This may actually be desirable if you need a mute passage for a background. The guidelines in the matrix hold the key to understanding color relationships. Grasp it and you'll be well on your way to choosing colors wisely rather than randomly. You see, many colors are visual equivalents, but are very different in their characteristics. If you choose a color simply because it looks right, luck becomes a factor in the outcome. Sometimes it'll work and sometimes it'll fail. So if the last section is clear in your mind, let's move ahead. If it's still a little vague, grab a cup of high-octane coffee, back up the tape, sit back and listen to it again. Text blocks in the video will help you keep track of colors and what the objectives are. Here's a little tidbit I'd like to share with you before we get started. When I'm layering one wash over another, whether I'm actually painting or doing examples, I normally put yellow down first. I found that yellows don't glaze well over other colors, but if placed on the paper first, they help to create a radiant glow as an underglaze. We'll start with transparent non-staining colors on the inner ring. You'll love these colors. They can be lifted from dampened paper without leaving a strong stain behind. Remember, however, if you do a lot of lifting, you'll have a tendency to reduce the effectiveness of the external sizing, and that will have a detrimental effect on luminosity. For the first exercise, we'll overlap washes of Aurelian, Permanent Rose, Cobalt Blue, and Viridian. These are all transparent non-staining colors and should reveal excellent luminosity when complete. Here's an Aurelian wash being laid down with the paper at a slight angle. Flat's okay too. Keep the brush strokes to a minimum. When you think the wash is dry, check it with the back of a finger. It shouldn't feel cool, but should be the same temperature as the paper. Don't rush it. If you're in doubt, wait a little longer, otherwise the colors will bleed and mix, negating your efforts. I've charged the brush with water, picked up some cobalt blue, and now make sure it's properly suspended on the mixing tray before proceeding to the paper. More often than not, washes are too thin rather than too heavy. Keep that in mind and try to create a wash that looks somewhat like this one. Look at the nuances of sensational color where the colors overlapped in different areas. This should give you a fair idea of how useful these transparent non-stainers are. Also, look at the areas outside the center where only two colors lapped. Normally, what I do when setting up to paint is to get about 3 to 5 colors suspended on the mixing tray, and then I draw upon these prepared pools to mix my color combinations. It's more efficient, and it keeps my paint wells much cleaner. Doing exercises, I follow the same procedure. Timing is important in the next exercise. You don't want your first puddle of color to dry while you're preparing the others. Notice how I pull a fairly good-sized glob of color to the tray and then discharge it. If I think I need a little more, I grab a little more before cleaning out the brush and going for the next color. Finally, when I have all of the concentrated colors out, I charge the brush with clear water and liquefy the colors so that they're as saturated with color as they can be and still be called the proper watercolor wash. When you see a dome to the puddle, that's a good indication that the wash is right. Of course, you might also have it a little too thin, but at least this gives you some information towards suspending your colors. The next video on water to paint ratio will help to make all of this clear, but for now, take a close look at these suspensions and try to duplicate them, looking for the dome. The objective of this exercise is to move those juicy puddles of color from your mixing tray onto the paper and then drag the colors together with the tip of your brush handle, mixing the colors in a central pool. You might never use a mixture like this while you're painting, but it's encouraging to see that even if you mix outlandish combinations, the result is still luminous because transparent non-staining colors are very user-friendly. By the way, I don't generally paint with the non-business end of my brush, but in this case, if you use the hairs, you'll either flood the pool with water discharge or absorb the pool. So the non-absorbent tip of the handle seems to be the best tool to do this exercise with. Remember how saturated this center pool was? I'm always amazed to see that it dries with such luminosity. This color mixture is dark, but it has lots of spunk. This is what makes watercolor a special medium, and that's why these transparent non-staining colors are so essential. In this example of mixing transparent non-staining colors, we're going to create the darkest dark possible using permanent rose, cobalt blue, and viridian. Like before, I'll pull the paint to the mixing tray, then I'll balance the color combination and add water to get the right suspension. To create a neutral dark, try using a little more of the permanent rose and viridian than cobalt blue. I find I don't always get as much paint on the paper as I'd like, so I discharge a little extra color using the brush tip like an eyedropper. Remember, if it looks too dark when it's wet, it'll probably be just right when it's dry. The result is good. Despite how dark this statement is, light is still bouncing back from the paper, illuminating the transparent non-staining paint crystals. In my opinion, this is a much better solution to creating a near black than using a tube color that lacks luminosity. This is similar to the first exercise, only this time we'll use semi-transparent non-staining colors. We'll use New Gamboge, quinacridone burnt orange, and sap green, checking between each wash to see that the previous one is thoroughly dry. By the way, you can use a hairdryer to expedite the drying, but only after the wash has lost its sheen, not before. My reflexes want me to run back over this sap green wash a second time, but if I do, I might lift the underlying layers and destroy the gold. I think it's better to leave it alone and hope for the best than to do something that will almost surely destroy the work. We're using only 3 colors, but the combination shows how important these colors also are. Remember, you can use them just like transparent non-stainers, except you need to use a little more restraint in how many you mix together. For our fifth example, tilt the paper just a little. First, I apply 2 pools of organic vermilion as our semi-transparent non-staining base color. Above one, I'll place a pool of viridian, a transparent non-staining color. And above the other, I'll place phthalo green, a transparent stainer. Next, I'll drag the greens down into the pools of vermilion and let them mingle. The differences are minor. While the transparent non-staining Viridian is clearly more compatible with the semi-transparent Vermilion, the phthalo green seems to cause very little damage and would have to be considered acceptable as well. Remember, we're moving inward from the stainers and not outward, so compatibility is predictably good. Also, note that the two greens are essentially visual equivalents, yet are very different in their characteristics. Without understanding the characteristics of colors, visual similarities often lead painters astray in their color mixing. In this sixth example, we'll glaze bands of transparent staining colors. If you remember the matrix, this one came up as transparent and luminous, just as the transparent non-stainers did. Again, lay down saturated washes and be patient enough to let each wash dry before applying the next. By the way, you can lay down a wash, move on to other examples, and come back to this later. It's a little boring watching water evaporate. When all the washes are completed, it's easy to see why these colors are so sensational. Sure, they have their drawbacks, but look at these rich and luminous nuances of color. Stay on the same ring or move inward rather than outward, and you'll be delighted to have these colors in your paint wells. Well, the seventh example should seem familiar. The second one was done the same way. Rather than a phthalo yellow, I'm using Aurelian. The other colors are alizarin crimson, or carmine, phthalo blue, and phthalo green. When I drag them together with the tip of the handle, I try not to mar the paper since impressing it will leave dark lines. If you use an aquarelle with a slant at the end of the handle, you could scratch the surface. True, it's only an example and not suitable for framing, but why not do your best anyway? Again, look at the luminosity in this dark. Maybe you have to see it in person to appreciate it, but you'll see what I mean after you do yours. It definitely has that stained glass effect. Once again, let's create the darkest neutral dark we can. This eighth example shows us how intense, dark, and glowing these transparent staining colors can be. Most manufacturers' color charts say these colors are opaque. I agree that they can be opaque, but you'd have to be a little off your rocker to use them that way. These colors have so much tinting strength they should only be used in a well-diluted manner, and even then, they're very intense. However, they're very capable of making lovely tints as well. Look at the transparency and luminosity of this dried example. Vary your mixture and maintain a light touch with your brush, and these colors will soar. Okay, a little more puddle painting. You've seen the good stuff. Now let's whip up a little mud. Here I'll mix cadmium yellow, cadmium red, French ultramarine, and phthalo green. The cadmiums with French ultramarine blue lack desirability to begin with since we have two opaques with a semi-opaque. But when we add a stainer like phthalo green, the stainer attacks the opaques and semi-opaque, making them less transparent than they were before. Drag the puddles together and mix them up in their little cauldron and wait for it to dry. It's interesting that when the mixture is wet, it looks as if it could be luminous. It must dry before you can judge it. This is a mute color statement. There's no light energy coming from the paper. All the light is reflecting off the surface of the paint like a child's poster paint. You may not have all of these colors, and even if you do, you'll probably decide not to use some of them after you see the results. First, I'll do 3 examples mixing opaques with stainers from the second ring. To start, I'm mixing anthracenoid red with cerulean blue. Next, I'll mix phthalo blue with light red. The third example is phthalo green with yellow ochre. While these may be acceptable for a mute passage where you don't want to draw attention, such as a background element, they would be less than desirable if you needed a glowing color. I find that these opaques have become unattractive, especially the yellow ochre. When used alone, these colors are vibrant and very useful as color notes. I especially like Indian red for that purpose, but when the stainers are introduced, they lose their singular beauty. Let's see what happens when we switch to visually equivalent transparent non-stainers in place of the stainers. I'll use permanent rose, cobalt blue, and hooker's green, and I think we'll find that the colors are not only more compatible than the staining anthracnard red, phthalo blue, and green, but they also make the opaques more transparent than they were alone. This is important to remember. If you want to use a particular opaque color but aren't delighted with its heavy appearance, try mixing a near visual equivalent transparent or semi-transparent non-stainer with it to make it more transparent. You'll generally maintain the character of the opaque, but it'll appear more luminous. Well, you can see from the results that the colors are more lively than the examples using the stainers. Still not ideal, but at least you know a little more about achieving luminosity even with opaques. Well, I hope you found the exercises useful for bonding the guidelines of the transparent watercolor wheel with the activity of painting. By the way, it makes sense to label the colors you used so that you can go back to them for later reference. Now we're ready to apply some of the guidelines you learned earlier in a simple study of a Mexican market scene. In order to keep you from nodding off while my brush is moving from the painting to the mixing tray and back, I'll compress time and occasionally skip ahead to a more useful training segment. You already know the paints I'll be using, but I'll mention them specifically as the study develops. As you can see, my sketch is already done. The paper is Twin Rocker's Handmade Rough, which has a visually sensational random pebbling of the surface. I've stretched the paper on a 1/4-inch plywood support board, which is sold as exterior doorskin at lumber yards. You'll find full instructions for stretching paper in my book. It's a practice I highly recommend, even with heavier papers such as this. This paper is very white, moderately hard, and the sizing allows for lifting, which is a terrific and seldom found feature with rough paper. The brushes I'll use are Daniel Smith's Autograph Series Kolinsky Sable Rounds, a number 6 and a number 9. The flats are their number 14 and number 16 Kolinsky Sables. When I'm doing a full painting, I don't limit myself to beginning solely with the transparent and semi-transparent non-staining colors, as I will here. Ordinarily, I'll skip around a bit and work with whatever I need, but I don't ignore the guidelines. By the end, I probably use the non-stainers at least 75% of the time. So I'll start by pulling some Aurelian to the mixing tray and laying down the base of yellow I spoke of earlier. The mixing tray I use is an enameled butcher's tray. Finding one that has a flat bottom is a challenge, but if you encounter one, grab it. The advantage of the enameled surface over plastic is apparent when you begin to spread out your colors into thinner washes. With plastic, the colors squirm and bead. On enamel, they stay put and are much easier to judge for density and color. Some advocate scrubbing the surface of plastic to resolve the beading problem, but I found the surface so susceptible to staining it eventually distorts your color judgment. As I mentioned earlier, I start with yellow to create a glowing foundation to areas that will include yellow either straight or in the mixture. There's one caveat to painting with yellow in this manner, however. Yellow sets pencil lines. So if you feel the lines will intrude on the painting, I'd suggest you partially erase them before laying down the Aurelian. Aurelian and permanent rose are now mixed to create a clean skin base tone. Since my first application of yellow was somewhat light in value, this wash should glaze over it without concern for the skin tone becoming too yellow. Here I'm skipping ahead using a mixture of cobalt blue permanent rose with a little Aurelian added to create a slightly grayed blue. Since I created variations along with a few value changes on the mixing tray, I'll get a little more mileage out of the mixture to state a few other objects as well.
Using the same mixing tray puddle with Aurelian, Permanent Rose, and Cobalt Blue, I'll slant the mixture more toward a grayed brown by proportionately using more Aurelian and Permanent Rose. Into this moist brown, I'll add quinacridone gold to create the sense of reflected light illuminating the wooden crate. For me, quinacridone gold is much more versatile and transparent than raw sienna. Now I've mixed organic vermilion with quinacridone gold to make the gold a little warmer. They're relatively close to each other on the ring of semi-transparent non-staining colors. A thought comes to my mind as I use analogous colors here, meaning colors close to each other on the wheel. When you use stainers with opaques or opaques with themselves, you'll find analogous colors aren't affected as greatly when combined as those opposite each other on the wheel, known as complements. This bit of information should help you fine-tune your color mixing in the future. I've chosen quinacridone burnt orange as an improvement over burnt sienna. I'm mixing it with cobalt blue to create a luminous grayed brown. With permanent rose and quinacridone gold, I'm pushing and pulling the brush, then speeding it up on its edge to allow it to skip over the paper to create a textural effect. The colors I'm using to darken the awning are quinacridone gold, permanent rose, quinacridone burnt orange, and cobalt blue. But what visually similar combination wouldn't I use in this case? Well, probably opaques with stainers such as yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, light red, and phthalo blue. This blue-violet is cobalt blue with a little organic vermilion. Skipping ahead a little, I'll restate the shadow flesh tone using quinacridone burnt orange and gold with a touch of cobalt blue to lightly neutralize the vibrancy. There's hundreds of combinations to create a dark brown, including twisting the cap of a dark brown tube color. But here I'm using the very transparent combination of quinacridone burnt orange, cobalt blue, and hooker's green. An advantage to using colors such as these is that they can be restated with good results if necessary. Using a 3/4 inch flat with a great chiseled edge, I'll use burnt orange and viridian to create the sense of depth with a receding, cooler color combination. Remember, I'm using all transparent and semi-transparent non-staining colors, so I have no concerns regarding incompatible mixtures inadvertently creating a muddy combination. By floating in some viridian and Hooker's green, the dark statement under the table will appear to recede further back in space. By using these transparent non-staining colors, I'm always fairly certain I'll end up with a clean, luminous statement. Using cobalt blue with burnt orange to darken it, I'll build the values of the milk can to create a metallic appearance. Now, shiny objects have a high value range with sharp contrast between values. Matte objects have a closer value range with a gradual change as the object turns or changes planes. Watercolors can look fine when they're mixed on a mixing tray or mixed on the paper. They even look great when they're wet on the paper. And then, like a miracle of nature, the wash dries as a gem or as unappealing as an oil spill on your garage floor. That's why I feel these solutions for predictable color mixing are so important for transparent watercolors. Now a light wash of cobalt blue helps convey the metallic quality of the can. To create a variety of colors I can use to paint a rustic market basket, I'm mixing quinacridone gold, burnt orange, and cobalt blue. Now I've added a little hooker's green to the mixture to darken it. To make some negative shapes recede, I'm using Viridian Cobalt Blue with a little burnt orange. I could use an opaque with a stainer to make it dull and recede even further, but here I choose not to. The warm gray of this bag is Aurelian, Permanent Rose, and Cobalt Blue. This light wash is organic vermilion and quinacridone gold. I'll skip ahead and paint some potatoes in this basket. The colors I'm using are organic vermilion, quinacridone gold, and cobalt blue, with follow-up touches of a darker variation to help create form. Well, here's the first opaque, and it's a semi-opaque at that. It's French ultramarine blue mixed with quinacridone burnt orange to create a blue-black. Although I'm using this French ultramarine semi-opaque for its density to help render a darker blue-black, I'll often use French ultramarine blue, ultramarine violet, cobalt violet, or manganese blue alone or in mixtures for their nature of settling into attractive granulated washes when dry. To soften the edges of the folds, I'll drag a damp brush around the edges of the wet wash. I feel it's important not to go back over it, otherwise the underlying layers might release. Last but not least, I'll mix some stainers to punctuate a few darks. I'm mixing phthalo green, alizarin crimson, and phthalo blue. Now this was just a short and elementary demonstration, but I think you can see that selecting colors thoughtfully is easy when you choose them according to their categories and how they interrelate. As you work with the wheel, its guidelines and matrix, you'll see how you can make earlier decisions to mix colors that explain the strength or delicacy, mass or lightness of your subject to help convey your painting's content or meaning more concisely.
Well, you've been asked to absorb quite a bit of information in the last 90 minutes, and I'm sure you were scratching your head on a few occasions. But since you've made it this far, you probably have a fairly good understanding of the transparent watercolor wheel system and how it easily takes the guesswork out of color mixing. I realize there are a lot of color theories being taught. Most have validity and are actually compatible with this one. Some painters advise using colors I wouldn't even consider combining, but in their defense I'll say this. It's my experience that even the muddiest combination, when properly suspended and applied correctly to fine paper, can produce a sensitive wash. It's a matter of control, seasoned practice, as well as the confidence to paint it resolutely. Unfortunately, the grand majority of watercolor painters aren't able to handle their colors that deftly. This is where you can benefit from this instruction to gain knowledge, proficiency, and then the confidence that will eventually allow you to paint that skillfully. At this point, I imagine you're anxious to put this newfound knowledge to work. With a little practice and patience, I'm certain your next paintings will be more luminous, saturated with deeper, cleaner color combinations. So go paint and have fun doing it. I hope to see you on the next video, and let's get together in a workshop sometime.